Thanks for coming out today. The Penn World Voices Festival was founded by Salman Rushdie and others in the years after 9/11 with the goal of keeping the channels of communication between the US and the rest of the world open at a time where they were being choked off. And at a moment of neo-isolationism in this country, the festival's mission has taken on new importance. We have about 90 events happening across the city just over this week. It ends tomorrow with a final closing lecture by Hillary Rodham Clinton, followed by a conversation with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie just across the street at the Great Hall at Cooper Union. And there's still a couple dozen events to come tonight and during the day tomorrow. So I urge you to take a look at the brochure if you haven't, to take a look at our website at penn.org and support our work to both celebrate and defend freedom of expression worldwide at PEN America. I'm delighted to introduce this panel and this topic. It's a topic that is close to our mission and purpose at PEN America, and this is a terrific panel to discuss it. I'm going to introduce them, and then I'll say a little bit just to set up the conversation, and then turn to our panelists. We have Yamiche Alcindor, who's the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and also a contributor to NBC News and to MSNBC. Before that, she was a national political reporter for the New York Times covering politics and social justice. She reported on the presidential campaigns of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and has written about the legacy of President Obama and his outreach to voters of color and anxieties of working class Americans, as well as on police killings. Welcome, Yamiche. We also have next to her Peter Barbey, who is president and CEO of the Village Voice here in New York and also of the Reading Eagle Company in Reading, Pennsylvania. His family has continuously owned and operated newspapers in Reading for 8 generations since 1796. He and his wife Pamela guide the Edwin Barbey Charitable Trust, which funds arts, human rights, and other charitable endeavors. We also John Januszewski, I should say, we were hoping to have Jill Abrams, and then when Jill Abrams broke her shoulder and couldn't travel here from Boston, we were hoping to have Sally Busby from the Associated Press, and when she was unable to come just about 36 hours ago, we were delighted that John Januszewski was able to step in, the AP's vice president and editor-at-large for Standards, who works with journalists and editors all over the world to ensure the highest levels of media ethics and fairness. And he has had a 26-year career at the AP, interrupted by a stint at the LA Times, and been a foreign editor for much of that time and a foreign correspondent all over the world. So welcome, John. And then finally, Bill Kristol, the founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, who's a regular on ABC's This Week and special event and election coverage, and also provides political commentary to a variety of other shows and outlets. Before starting the Weekly Standard, he led the Project for the Republican Future, helping shape the strategy that produced the 1994 Republican congressional victory, and prior to that served in senior roles in the Reagan and Bush administrations. Welcome, Bill. So just briefly, for PEN America, our mission is to defend free expression. And the problem of fake news, or what we prefer to call fraudulent news, because we just think the term fake news is used so many different ways by so many different people that it has become almost meaningless and confuses more than it enlightens. But for the most part, fraudulent news is information that would be, and communication that would be protected by the First Amendment. It's not illegal in this country under most circumstances to lie or to put out a story that is false. And yet, writ large, fraudulent news, we believe, poses a great danger to free expression and even to our democracy, because it impairs our ability to find and discover the truth, and the role of our public discourse as a platform and a sphere of ideas that allow individuals to ferret out their own beliefs, to ferret out facts, to understand what's happening in the world around them, to make responsible decisions as citizens, as voters. And so we have identified squarely fraudulent news as a free expression problem, a threat to free expression. We put out a report on the topic late last year and are now working with a bunch of coalition organizations to look at what the solutions are. And the problem keeps changing, and we learn almost daily of new tactics, new methods of spreading fake news, of the impact and the reach of it. So I'm delighted to have this conversation with these panelists and such a distinguished group today. And I'm going to ask each of them to open up our talk with just a few thoughts, and then we'll enter into conversation up here on stage, and then we'll open it up to all of you to take part. So first I'm going to turn to Yamiche for your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Is this on? Yes, yes.
Can you hear her?
Okay, can you hear me? Great. So thanks so much for joining us today. It's really, really exciting to be here. When I started thinking about how to prepare for this panel, I decided to write down a couple things, which is that I think fake news is both the most threatening thing to democracies and to countries all over the world, but also a concept that can really reignite what is really our interest and our need for the truths, no matter how difficult they are. So when I think about fake news, there's different ways to think about it. The one is, of course, the political side. It's what we're talking about, why we're probably talking about it right now, which is that we have world leaders, both in America and abroad, who are using the term to just kind of put aside reporting by me and other people that are absolutely really calling into question how governments should function, how people should believe the things that are going on around them, and to call into question the powers that we're supposed to call into question as journalists. But I think that the other thing that's important here is, as someone who's covered race and politics, is when we think about fake news, there's also this idea of fake ideas. If I wrote a story that said America was completely equal, or that black people were treated completely the same as white people, that would also be considered fake news. And I think we really need to kind of deepen our idea of what it means, because it's too easy to just say, oh, we're talking about the things that are on Facebook that you should look out for. You should really just be looking at these stories and these publications. I think it's way deeper to think about how do we understand the world around us, and how much are we willing to really challenge in our own lives to make us think make us think differently about the truths that we hope were true, including, I think, the fact that America is equal and that people are living in desegregated times, when we know that America is not equal, and that people are living in very segregated times. So apart from the political aspect, which I'm happy to talk about as a White House correspondent, I think we need to dig a little deeper and talk about race and politics and inequality.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, maybe it's because I'm a businessman, but I think that in a way this is structural. Fake news seems to have taken off with the internet, and structurally, the internet is built around our platforms, our private platforms, Google and Facebook being the two big ones. And Facebook, of course, is on Congressional Hill, right on Capitol Hill right now, or just was. And I think you have to go back and look. In the 1990s, there were two laws passed that helped create Google and Facebook. One was the Communications Decency Act, and that
speak right into the mic.
Oh,
I want to
that
make sure
the Communications Decency Act, and that absolved liability. And then there was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which enabled the platforms to publish copyrighted material that newspaper can't do that without paying for it, but they can. So it kind of opened up scale, and it's been wonderful, all this explosion of information, but it's been kind of like the Wild West. And the platforms really aren't, it's not in their best interest to regulate it. I think there's going to be public pressure to do that. But we have to figure out how we do that. I mean, there is such a thing as free speech. So it's kind of structural. It used to be that a newspaper, like my family's newspaper, that was the platform, right? We had to adhere to liability. We have attorneys. You have to pass copy by. We can't use other people's material. Those things have kind of gone away. So, I think the congressional hearings with Facebook, it's a start, but I think they have to ask some real questions. What can we do to prevent an environment that encourages fake news?
John?
Well, I think what I would focus on, fake news is really a poisonous and corrosive term, and it's being weaponized not only here in the United States, but around the world to attack journalists and the work that they do. for all of its flaws, the United States has been a beacon for freedom of expression and freedom of the press. And just by upholding those values, it was able, to some extent, to hold back the dam of authoritarianism overseas. But now we see leaders like President Duterte in the Philippines. We see Viktor Orban in Budapest in Hungary. We see the Law and Justice Party in Poland embracing this idea of fake news and using it as a club to defeat ideas they do not like. And without the sort of moral authority of the U.S. Or Western Europe fighting against this trend, I'm afraid we're seeing all over the world journalism under attack, in retreat. We now have more journalists imprisoned around the world than at any other time in the last decades, and not to mention the 60 or 70 journalists who are killed each year. So I really would like to see this term fake news be recognized for what it is, which is an attack on factual reporting and the very idea that there can be facts that we can all agree on. But I do feel that one of the issues in this country particularly is the extreme political polarization that is causing people to close their minds to facts they don't like. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks. Bill?
I actually agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I guess that's just three cautions. I mean, one, we shouldn't be too nostalgic for a past that never existed. There's obviously been a huge amount of propaganda and fraudulent news, both simply misreporting and invention of things, certainly in the case of race in America for centuries. But, you know, one thinks even great news organizations like the New York Times had correspondents who later turned out were duped, or not duped, but played along with Stalin. Walter Duranty famously reporting from Moscow in the 30s. The same is true, obviously, on the other side of the political spectrum. And you know, radio in the 30s with Father Coughlin, or in the 50s with Westbrook Pegler. I mean, there's been quite a lot of this. I think the technology presents new challenges today. Having a president who embraces it presents really new challenges. Whatever one thinks of all the presidents we've had, they've mostly they may have benefited a little bit from this or tolerated it more than they should have, but this sort of full-out embrace of fraudulent news or propaganda by the president really makes it a problem of different quality. Now, maybe it's a 4 year problem, not a permanent problem, but it is an actual, it makes it a little more dangerous, I would say, than just having a senator, Joe McCarthy, or particular individuals who are prominent pushing these stories. And also, what you're talking about, I mean, it also, the president who just routinely denigrates any sort of notion that there are facts, that there is truth, and himself seems somewhat oblivious to it, or not oblivious isn't even fair. I mean, purposely simply distorts it when he chooses to. Again, that's a little different, I think, and qualitatively different from previous presidents who've obviously had their own spin, as we say, and their own version of things, but a little different level here. So that, I think, is a big problem. It's again, presidents, we only have one president, and it's a big bully pulpit, as we say, and he uses it to bully quite a lot, and in a way that I think other presidents have been somewhat reticent to do, maybe a little less so in wartime, but even then, I'd say with different motives than our current one. Secondly, but still, I would caution about sort of assuming it was always great. It's a problem of democracy. You know, it's a free country. People are going to abuse freedoms. You don't want to abridge freedoms because some people are abusing them, and it's a problem the founders understood. It's a problem Tocqueville understood. It's a problem that every serious student of liberal democracy over centuries has understood. So which brings me to my second point, which I'll just say very briefly, which is I do worry that we go so far in the other direction that we forget that the First Amendment is a very good thing in America, that, you know, one can say John Stuart Mill was too simple-minded in his defense of liberty, and that was 19th century liberalism and all that. But at the end of the day, John Stuart Mill was basically right about, I think, being pretty intransigent in defending freedom of speech, freedom of opinion. Tocqueville was right to worry about tyranny of the majority infringing on freedom of opinion and freedom of thought, even. And I'm a fairly strong First Amendment person, even if we pay some price for it, which we are doing now. And final point, I would say, and this is in a way echoes the point about structural questions. We tend to be very obsessed with the First Amendment. Lawyers litigate it, and it's a very bold statement. But structurally, we should be grateful that we have a situation here that's not like the Philippines or like Venezuela or like Hungary, where it's so easy to undermine other institutions because you've elected a demagogue as president who would like to do so. I mean, we do have a very strong set of institutions here, governmental, non-governmental, different levels of government, civil society, the media, the courts, the legal profession. Some are stronger than others, some are they're all, I'd say, actually doing pretty well in the current moment. Not all, almost all doing pretty well, though, I would say. And it's a reminder that one shouldn't take these things for granted. Other liberal democracies that have, we shouldn't praise ourselves for it too much either. I mean, we have the benefit of just having been going a long time and a big wealthy country, and so it's easier for us. But it is important to keep those institutions strong and viable, but you can't depend on the goodwill of individual leaders. You need to have actual structures in place that make it harder for one bad actor as president or a few bad actors in Congress or a governor or whatever to really undermine these institutions, which we do see happening elsewhere around the world.
So, Yamiche, I want to come back to something you said about giving us, I think, as an example of fake news, mischaracterization of the state of race relations or equality in this country. And I think, probably we could all agree, if somebody wrote a piece like that, it would be false and we'd disagree with it, or I would. But is that fake news? I mean, is there a difference between sort of a poorly reasoned, weakly grounded opinion or unfounded opinion and fake news? Or, in your mind, are they kind of the same thing or part of the same category?
I mean, I think that if it's patently false, then it's patently false. So if it's a fake news story that says Hillary Clinton really could have won if she only had, if someone hadn't stolen the election from her, if there was some person who, like if there's like just a story out there that says that there was some teenager who broke into all the election machines, that's obviously fake news. But I think that I would challenge people to say that if there's a story out there, I'm not talking about in a column, I'm talking about if we're writing stories after stories that say America's actually very desegregated, that every African American and white person is treated the same, then yeah, that would be a fake news story. But I think that what's also important is this idea that when we look at, or at least what the reporting shows when it comes to Russia, is that they had this idea that they knew what divided America almost better than Americans in some way. So they literally had events that were Black Lives Matter events and events that were Trump supporter events. So there's this idea that like they understood that there are things that in America we're still trying to wrestle with as actual problems that people vehemently disagree about. So I think that we should regard a story that says that African Americans are treated equally in the same light as someone who says this teenager stole the election because this person broke into all the election machines. I think both of those are true. I mean, as in that both of those are as bad as each other.
What about this question of sort of, it's in a newspaper, a physical paper, let's say, or even a serious news site, newspaper site online, the distinction between a news story and an opinion column is crystal clear. But in a lot of other contexts, let's face it, it's not anymore. I mean, there are many websites where, it's not clear whether something's being presented as a news story or, an opinion piece or some combination. On cable television, there are guests. There could be one panel with 6 or 8 faces, and some of the people have reported on the story and are offering those insights and those facts, and other people may be there, as a representative of a campaign, and they've got a totally different agenda as part of that conversation. And yet, as they sort of sit side by side, if you weren't schooled and you didn't know their backgrounds or weren't that focused, you might not know the difference. So is that part of the issue here? To what extent is that blurring of lines, which I think has been a gradual process, part of what complicates matters now?
Well, it's interesting. The difference is what kind of publication are you, I think. If you're a political publication, it's okay to blend opinion. I mean, I think people expect that. If you're a newspaper, you have a responsibility to the community, and people see you differently. So you have to be careful about blending opinion in the news reports, and you have to create clear lines. What's opinion? You try hard to do that, right? And getting back to what I was saying earlier, there's also a liability question. You just can't say anything in a news report. So in an opinion piece, you can say that's my opinion. So honestly, I think it's a case of community. If you're responsible to the community, if you feel that responsibility is part of your core business plan as a newspaper, then you're going to be very careful. But if you're a partisan journal, you don't care. I mean, you just don't care.
But I don't know. I mean, I think that lets people off the hook too easily. Look, we started the Weekly Standard in September of '95, and one of the first things in the summer of '95, we got some office space, and one of the first things we did was go out and buy what you needed to have. This is just as the internet was beginning, a classic case of like not seeing what was coming. So we dutifully went out and bought all kinds of reference books, because every magazine has to, and newspaper, no, you had to have a little library so you could fact check everything before you put the magazine to bed on Thursday night. And we hired a fact checker, and we have a fact checker to this day, actually. And we use Google, obviously, and everything else, not a physical library. We gave those books away to some high school that's since, I'm sure, disposed of them, 3 or 4 years after we started the magazine. But I do think serious journals of opinion, The Nation, New Republic, Weekly Standard, I mean, we all had fact checkers and tried to be accurate when we were reporting facts. Obviously, we had points of view and so forth, and that's, so I think there is still a pretty big line between that kind of opinion, and then we started to slide off into, and this is partly a technological thing, I think, with the web and all, but we started to slide. I mean, there are many places, websites today, that it wouldn't even occur to them that they would have that. And in fact, there's no process for it, because if you can post, we never let people post their articles onto the website without having an editor look at them and query things. And with a few people now, we gave privilege of sort of posting directly, but they were experienced journalists, and we thought they could be trusted.
You do have that now.
But now, I mean, if you talk to a typical person starting a website now, the idea that an editor would have to sign off on something, or that there'd be someone in the office who was called a fact checker, I think that doesn't exist at many of the places now that are breaking news more quickly, and that are not breaking news, but that are promulgating news and getting clicks, and then you get the whole internet and everything else. And so I think it has, I do think it has, contrary to what I was saying earlier about not being too nostalgic for the old days, in that respect, there is sort of an issue of standards that really has been elided, I would say, over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, you're the standards editor, John. What do you say, and are you able to sort of defend against this sliding?
I think, there are two phenomenons here. There's the actual news that's meant to be fraudulent, that's meant to deceive, and that's something we should all unite to fight against. And there's always been flawed journalism, like the story you promulgated that everything is hunky-dory in this country concerning race. That would be a very flawed piece of journalism because it's not balanced. I think for news consumers, for people who want to find out about the world, they should, go to those sites that have a commitment to facts, to showing how they got their facts, how many people they interviewed, were they talking anonymously, were they giving their names, if there's a document at stake, in question, are they posting that document? Those are the kind of indicators of trust that you can rely on that kind of information. And the other thing, as you pointed out, even applies to opinion journals like yours, a sort of a basic commitment to fairness. So if you're going to talk about a policy dispute or a political dispute, even if you're going to come out on one side or the other, give a fair rendition of the other point of view. So people feel that they're getting a well-rounded insight into whatever you're talking about. And going back again to your example, which I think is excellent, if you had something like that, you would need to get people speaking from the other side. And this, I think, journalists who are so concerned these days about the erosion of trust in all institutions, but in particular journalism, the way to try to win back the trust is to talk about what we do, how we do it, show our work, and I believe in the marketplace of ideas, those publications that do that will be the ones that survive.
Can I just add one thing? I was
Go
just
ahead.
thinking about this, which I think that was an interesting. So I mean, just since I'm probably the only person in this room who was on Fox News for a bunch of years, and I don't watch it anymore. But I would say, I mean, I am struck when I occasionally flip it on. It was one thing; it was conservative. It was not really fair and balanced. That was just something to get people annoyed. You know, it was had a point of view, but most of it was not crazy or conspiratorial or knowingly just false. I mean, it was one-sided, you could say, and so forth. And I do think that is a pretty shocking. I mean, when you look at it now, and that's that's the biggest, I guess, or cable news network, especially the evening shows. And I don't watch many of them at all, really, but you see little clips of them, of course, and read about what people are saying. There is a level of just outright removal from not even getting things wrong, but no interest in getting things right. It's purely what story can I half make up or distort or wildly exaggerate that will advance whatever narrative I want to advance today. In the old days, it was more, look, here's one point of view, here's another. I think this one's, it was maybe wrong or off or unbalanced a little bit. But so there, I think you have a problem. And to the degree that that's become pervasive, some of it on both sides, but to be honest, it's more on the right, especially in the era of Trump. And Trump, again, Trump so much magnifies and amplifies it. I do think just one wants to get into structural problems and deeper problems, and it's happening around the world, so it can't just be Trump, which is true. And there's populism, and there's this, and there's social media, and I do think that's a very important technological phenomenon. Having said all that, it really makes a difference that a person is president who is shameless about embracing propaganda and discrediting legitimate efforts to report the news.
Peter, you said it depends what kind of publication you are. But I think from the perspective of the reader, increasingly, and a rising generation of readers, it really doesn't, because they're barely paying attention to what publication you are. They're reading your story on their phone. They've gotten it through Facebook, through Twitter, or another social media platform. The indicia of, they're not looking at the masthead or the fact-checking policy or any other facet, of the publication itself and how it's put together. They're just reading the story. And, we were talking backstage about stories we'd read. We couldn't remember where it was from, and that's normal. I mean, you're just digesting a ton of stuff in real time. And so in that environment where there's such it's a kind of a mosh pit of stories and information, is there a way, and how do the publications and the stories with credibility that actually are reported, are balanced, how do those shine through, or do they? And that's for any of you.
Well, it's almost impossible because they're fed one story at a time. And the big platforms, Google and Facebook, have their own news feeds. I mean, there is Google News. And they'll aggregate whatever they decide to. Or, a smaller platform like Dredge, he'll aggregate whatever he decides to. So it's daunting. It's almost impossible to control what you're creating as a news creator, with a newsroom, outside of our own environment. So that's the structural problem.
But I would say one contrarian point is younger people, who are the most obviously reading things on phones, and I do very much agree. As an editor, it's a little disappointing. You go to some work to put together the magazine with balance of articles and culture and back of the book, and most people online are not coming to the homepage to see the whole magazine. They're coming to individual articles, and they're going back to Twitter or Facebook, whatever they're on, and then they get to another article, which is fine. You get actually more readers out of the whole process, but the whole notion of editing a magazine kind of has become less important. That's just a technological fact. But look, young people are less taken in, not more. So that, I think, is good news. In my personal experience, I don't know if we have data on this, but certainly what really spooked me was being on a weekly standard cruise. So we have these cruises for our subscribers. A lot of the times, everyone does it now. The Times does it, Nation, everyone. You make a little extra money. They get to go on a nice cruise somewhere, and they have panels with, people from the magazine and maybe a few guests and so forth. And people telling me, this was September of 2017, some of our readers weren't so happy that I was too anti-Trump and so forth. But then we have dinner with them and so forth. And these are intelligent, well-off people, mostly retired or older, the kind of people who go on cruises and have the money to do so and so forth, and telling me things that were just false. I mean, they just sort of look, that's just not true. I mean, that there are 3 million voters, illegal votes cast, for example, in the recent election. This is a factual question. We don't know exactly how many there were, but it's nothing like just 3 million, to say the least. It's been much, much, much looked into, and you try to tell people it was false, and these, as I say, are not credulous 21. The problem isn't credulous 21-year-olds. That's what's sort of odd, right? You'd think it would be them because they've grown up in this modern environment. The problem is credulous 70-year-olds who are, and this is where maybe it'll take care of itself a little bit. Maybe 21-year-olds understand how Facebook works, how Twitter works, and so forth, and have a kind of skepticism, which is healthy. One had the feeling sometimes talking to these people that they were used to the old news. They didn't realize that there'd been a transformation. They were used to kind of more or less believing what they read if it looked like it was presented in a form that was kind of respectable looking. And now they were getting something on Facebook that sort of looked respectable or being forwarded by a friend in a cut and paste email. And well, they read it online. They read it. Someone sent it to them, so it must be true. So maybe the skepticism and distrust of younger people will end up being healthy.
John?
I just wanted to add, not to defend Facebook or Google, but both those platforms are working on ways, adjustments to the algorithms to raise up in people's feeds the more reliable news organizations, and I think that would be a helpful trend. And I think the idea that the audience can develop more critical skills, like the younger people you're talking about, I think is also hopeful that people, at least now we're all talking about this issue of false information circulating on the web. So I think people's guards are up a little higher now, or at least I hope they are, after this fevered discussion we've been having. Yeah,
although I just want to throw something else in the conversation, which is I think there is greater skepticism, and you sort of, those growing up now know that you can't believe much of what you read, and they really, but that skepticism is for everything. I mean, a story that they read in the New York Times may or may not be true. Something that they hear on CNN, and whenever there was a mistake, and you draw the distinction, I think rightly, between intentionally false stories and errors or poor reporting. But all of that can be blended together into, I think, kind of just an overall threshold level of trust in news and information that is diminished. And does that pose its own risks?
I think it's a risk to democracy itself. I mean, if you don't think there's good information, how can you decide what's true and then who to vote for, right?
And Yamiche, you covered an election. So.
I would say that as a reporter, it is scary, but it's also something that I think is having skepticism and knowing that it's out there makes me as a reporter want to make sure I'm laying out even more why I'm coming to the conclusion that I'm coming to. So if some people are thrown off by the idea that I'm like, oh, America is not equal, well, I can just show you statistics on education. I can show you statistics on who's in prison. I can show you statistics on healthcare. I can show you statistics on the fact that black babies are twice as likely to die than white infants when they're being born. So there's so many different kind of levels of discrimination that it's almost like, okay, but it's good for me in some ways, because then it can say, well, yeah, this is why I think this way. So in some ways it helps me further educate people, because then I can lay out why I think that, like, saying America's super equal is just as bad as saying there's a green giant that installed Donald Trump to be president. Like, I think that all of those things should be things that we should be critical of. And I think it is, for far too long, journalists, if you get a great job at a good publication, PBS or somewhere else, you're like, okay, well, now we have the backing and people are gonna believe us. I think now to be able to kind of have a lightning in your back that says, I have to assume that people are looking at my reporting with skepticism, so I have to lay out the case. I have to, the Washington Post and the New York Times just won the Pulitzer Prize for covering stories having to do with Russia and Donald Trump. That's because they were laying out piece by piece what was going on. And that maybe they would have been doing that reporting anyways, but I think now it's even more important because they can walk people through why, even this weekend, Michael Cohen might be someone that President Trump should be worried about. It's not just because journalists are out there talking about it. Maggie Haberman today had a story that was walking you through, here's the years of people who have witnessed him on the record talking to his lawyer in a way that's discriminatory or a way that was not nice. So now you can say, oh, it's not just Maggie tweeting about the fact that this might be the case. She has several sources telling her this, and some of them are named, and some of them are the closest people that President Trump is with, like Roger Stone. It's undeniable that they have a relationship. So I think that in some ways it's good for journalism.
So I want to come back to something you brought up, John, which is these measures that social media platforms are taking to try to incorporate indicia of credibility into the way that they present the news. So, and I've actually seen that. I mean, I found half the time they make a big announcement about something they knew they're doing, and you go onto your Facebook page or your Google Newsfeed, and you don't see any sign of it. But actually, I have seen a sign of this on Facebook over the last week or two. There's sort of a little box, and if you hover or click, you'll see, this is the New York Times. It's been publishing, for umpteen years, and it's won all these prizes. And it's a way, if you're looking for that, you can find out. I mean, but my question is, talking about sort of our news ecosystem. I mean, I like that idea because most of the publications that they probably are going to validate are ones that I believe in and trust. But we've also seen a lot of new players even over the last few years, like a BuzzFeed, a Vox, a Business Insider. If they kind of come on into a world where, there's that kind of gating, and, if you're not sort of given a grade A from day one, you're downgraded in the algorithm and you can't get your stories out, is that a worry? And, there's also sort of civil society organizations and small publications that are trying to have a voice, maybe trying to provoke or bring to light aspects of a conversation that are less heard, voices that get excluded from the mainstream. So how do we, kind of validate trust without making it a more closed system?
Yeah, that is a problem. I think the people who are putting together these algorithms are looking at things like what you mentioned, the background of the site. A lot of times it has to do with explaining who the journalist is, who wrote the story, and even to the point of footnoting the facts in the story to allow people to see. But I think there is a danger in all these fact-checking initiatives because a lot of times things are not black and white. They are factual, but maybe there's spin or opinion worked in, or they're largely factual, or they're largely false, but there's a germ of truth in it, and you don't want it to curtail debate. So I think as we move forward, we'll get more sophisticated about separating out those news sites that are purely for the purposes of distortion and misleading people. The kind, the National Enquirer, the kind of things that the tabloids that you see at the supermarket, that those type of sites will be kind of looked at in those ways, that you can still buy it, you can still see it, but you just know in your heart that you can only believe about 1/10 of what's printed in them. And I think that's where we'll get. And to what you were saying, I think even if I think it was your point that there's just a general degradation of trust in media because of all this froth around issues of truth. But I think the way people are dealing with it is they're sort of triangulating. They're getting information from several news sites, and when they line up, they get an idea of what they really can believe and trust.
But if I could, I mean, we've worked a little with Facebook and Google at the Weekly Standard, actually, and so I think there is some genuine good faith efforts to, so in our case, to tell us more about conservative magazines and which ones, how could we do good fact checking and make sure that reasonable ones do better in a sense, and we're not just at Facebook, the algorithm isn't hyping the most, sometimes the ones that get more clicks, but less responsible journalism. Having said that, I guess I'm enough of an old-fashioned classical liberal I'd sort of prefer for there to be just a multiplicity of sources and let them figure there'll be mistakes, and some people will rise high who don't deserve to, and some institutions will, but ultimately the market will sort of sort it out. And what is weird is Facebook, really. I mean, when you get right down to it, I mean, that one privately held publicly held corporation, but in which actually a few individuals have a huge percentage of the voting stock. So it's not even really more like a classic publicly held corporation. I mean, you say, well, they're going to work on the algorithm. Well, that's a little weird. I mean, I'm not saying I have no easy solution to it. I'm skeptical of some of the regulatory proposals about Facebook. I don't know that breaking it up would do any good. I don't know that A, B, or C would do any good. Maybe it's just kind of where we are, and I don't want the government to make those decisions either. But it is just different. The normal situation, the normal answer to your question would be, okay, there's the Times, and there's the Journal, and there's the Post, and there's 3 local papers, and there's 5 local TV stations. And, out of that hubbub, there'll be some checking and balancing and some ability for people to sort things out and really false things to be discredited. And one is a little nervous about Facebook hiring X number of people and deciding on an algorithm which then decides what tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in the U.S. and incidentally outside the U.S., sort of what order they see things in. So I think there's a governance question about the big tech companies in general, but I think Facebook is actually the biggest most problematic of the big ones, which I have no easy solution to, but it would be good to have a serious debate about. I don't know that having Zuckerberg before Congress for a few hours is that serious, but maybe it's a good thing that at least, they got there and it's fine, and Standard Oil, in the old days, became a monopolist basically in oil and did a lot of good for the country by discovering all this oil, I guess, energy and so forth, and modern transportation. But at the end of the day, they were broken up, and I'm not so sure that having a serious look at the structural way in which on the internet we permit a kind of concentration of power and authority online that we would not permit in a normal situation. We do have multiple television channels, and one doesn't control any of them. And part of being
those rules have been loosened too.
Yeah, but even so, being a common carrier, you sort of have to carry all of them, or the custom at least is. So you do literally on your TV get MSNBC and Fox and C-SPAN and other things. So there's a kind of variety of things. It would be as if we had Comcast deciding what parts of Fox, MSNBC, CNN, NBC, ABC, people were going to see in what order. And that's not quite. Google in that respect is more of a neutral platform. It can do some things with its algorithm. At the end of the day, you can search for The Nation on Google, you can search for The Weekly Standard, you can search for, Human Rights Watch. I mean, it is kind of more like a library, you might say, with a particular, with everyone is in it. Like libraries, they can make some parts of it more prominent and easier to find than others, or bookstores. But still, there's a kind of multiplicity of sources. The weird thing about Facebook, and this is just intrinsic to the way Facebook works, I think, as I understand it, which is not that well probably, is that it has to kind of help select what you're going to see first, because otherwise you just, there has to be some principle of selection. And once it does that, you are giving one company an awful lot of power over what people see as news.
Peter?
Yeah, I've got to echo that. I agree. And I think on top of that, there's a faith in science, a faith in algorithms, that somehow that magically fixes things. But people write the algorithm, and they write the algorithm the way they think. I remember seeing a picture of the Facebook team that writes algorithms. It was only 12 people, so it might maybe part of the team, but it was all guys. I mean, it was 12 guys.
And also, John Jones, who's an 82-year-old person who likes a certain kind of story. Facebook has an interest in maximizing people staying online as long as possible and staying on Facebook as long as possible, right? Which means they want to provide people things that interest them, which is great when you get something that's, you're a sports fan and they give you the sports news, the breaking sports news, instead of the breaking news from the New York City Ballet or something, and which you would not care about. So you can't really begrudge Facebook giving you what you want, but in political reporting and opinion, giving you what you want means he's the kind of guy who likes birther stories, so we're going to give him just a ton of birther stories. And that is sort of, this is how the algorithm works almost of necessity. The way it works is like with Amazon. If you like this book, you'll like these other books.
I would say, though, that people have been self-selecting what they like for a long, long time. If you are someone who leans to the left, you probably watch one network. If you're someone who leans to the right, you watch another network. If you're someone who kind of leans to maybe in the middle, but you're probably watching multiple networks. I know my mom, she's someone who loves international news and American news. So I grew up in a household where when something big happens in America, we not only watch CNN or MSNBC, but we then turn on and watch BBC. And my mom watches the news in French because she's from Haiti, so she'll watch the French news. And it's a completely different like it's a completely kind of weird thing when you watch American News on America from an international point of view, because you realize that there's an American bias to how Americans cover other Americans, because we don't want to look crazy, right? Like we're like, our country is not as terrible as it could be. We're like, Europeans are like, who are these people? So it's like, it's a very kind of interesting thing to watch. So I think that when you think about what Facebook's doing, I think it goes back to this idea that maybe it's showing us what we were already doing. We already kind of were selecting things that made us feel comfortable. And I know a lot of people who don't want to watch Fox News because
But they're selecting it for you, which is a little different from
Yeah.
you selecting yourself. People have a tendency towards social
Well-
norming and herding, and everyone understands that. I mean, there's that's an intrinsic problem with just people and all of us. But I do think, I have no solution to this, and I'm not blaming Facebook. I just think the way it actually works is your mom can look at BBC and then a French language network, and then at CNN, or we all go on. I go online if there's breaking news abroad. I'm sure we all do this, depending on limitations of language and stuff, and try to get better news by going to France 24 or something if it's an election in France, right? Because they're going to have more up-to-date reporting than the Times maybe or the Post. But again, it's as if the fact that Facebook, and it almost has to do this, is selecting for you what to see. It just makes it a little more
I just think
problematic.
the result could be the same, that if you are really interested in birtherism, you're Googling birtherism, you're then turning on the network that's giving you the birtherism stories, and then you're going on Facebook and they're kind of being like, oh, we know that you like birtherism, here's some more birtherism.
Yeah. Well, I think they've been so criticized for that, though. I think those platforms are looking for ways, at least to limit the big abuses, and it is a tremendous concentration of power on their part, and maybe there is a regulatory solution, but these are now global platforms, and how do you regulate that? So in the absence of any quick solutions, I think some regulation is worthwhile, but on the other hand, it creates a really interesting free speech issue, because in any other context, when we talk about regulating speech, our instinct is to say no, do not do that. But
It's also, it's the Trump administration potentially regulating what is and isn't fake news, which is, what definition will be used? I think we have to ask. I'm going to open up to the audience in a minute. So there are mics here at the front of the room. I think there's also someone who can come around to you if you don't want to come here. But if people do come to the mics, I'm going to turn to you, those at the mics first. And I guess I want to come back to an example you brought up about the Michael Cohen story. So, that story gets published this morning. It's well sourced. Donald Trump then, comes out with a barrage of tweets trying to discredit it and discrediting the reporter, Maggie Haberman, by name. And, do we just wind up in a situation where 40-something% of our country believes his tweets, which undoubtedly will be echoed tonight on Fox News, and there'll be an alternative narrative, and someone who knows Michael Cohen, will come forward and give his or her version of events. And, the reporting, and you made the point that you're doing now, there's sort of an impetus to do more thorough and careful reporting to overcome skepticism. But do you believe that reporting can actually kind of cut across, and that the people who are in that, call it the Trump bubble, the Fox News watching, the National Review cruise going audience is going to pay more attention to these reports because they are better sourced, or is that almost a lost cause?
I'm not sure. It's really kind of almost in some ways an unanswerable question, because it's going to be people's personal opinions of whether or not they believe a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, or they believe someone who is the president of the United States and is very close to Michael Cohen. Like both of those people have to kind of in some ways make their own personal decision. And I think that Donald Trump, with something like, last time I checked, was 40 million followers, but probably more now. He has almost as many, if not more followers now than the New York Times. So there's this idea that he in and of himself has built this brand and built this following where people believe, a lot of the people that voted for him believe what he said. So if that's the case, then maybe Maggie's reporting won't cut across. But it's really, I think, a personal thing. And I think I've talked to a lot of Trump supporters who believe everything that he says, who really believe that he is someone who is being attacked by the media because he's trying to change the way that American politics are. Then I've talked to some Trump voters who realize that maybe he's not always telling the truth, but are kind of entertained by it. And I know some Democrats that are kind of just like entertained by all the craziness and say, oh, well, you know, like this is kind of a long joke that's going to play out for a couple of years and then we'll all go back to normal. But I don't know if we're ever going to go back to quote unquote whatever we had before. But I think it's really hard to say what's going to happen and whether or not people will care.
Did you, in your discussions with Trump voters, did you take away anything about your reporting or the work of the New York Times or the PBS NewsHour that might make it more likely that those stories would be believed and credited?
I think it's just, I don't think that, personally, I don't think that journalists should be changing anything that they're doing. I mean, I think when I said that it makes you want to do more, I think obviously the New York Times has dozens of Pulitzers to show that they've always been sourcing stuff and always been really good at their reporting. So I don't think that anybody's really changing the way that they're reporting to try to make sure that Trump voters or Trump supporters will take you more seriously. But I think that from the places that I've been to, we just have to do a good job of laying out for people, here's what the facts are. If you either believe them or you don't. I think it's really good to be able to go into people's homes and talk to Trump supporters about why they believe the things that they believe. I once interviewed a man who said black people just hate working. They just don't want to work. And I'm like standing there as a working black woman, like, okay. And like, what do I do to that? Like, all I can do is lay that out that I'm actually a working black woman as we speak. Like, it doesn't matter. So in some ways, you just have to be like, okay, well, thank you it was nice to meet you, and I can just like lay out that there are black people who work, and here it is. Like, so in some ways, it's like, am I gonna obsess about how to tell a story to convince people that this is what's right? Not particularly for me, and I don't think most reporters are going home at night thinking, I really need people to believe my reporting over what they believe personally.
I mean, luckily the media is not the only institution to check leaders in this country, and I went back and read about Watergate recently, since it's obvious parallels. The media narrative of Watergate, and it's understandable, emphasizes the role of the media, and there's all the President's Men was a good movie, and all that was very exciting. Really, the courts were very, very. Judge Tariqa was very, very important. Criminal lawsuits are very important. Civil lawsuits are very important. I don't want to glorify courts or lawyers; they can get things wrong too, but they don't have the same rules. They do actually have rules of evidence and cross-examination, and judges who principle at least are trying to find to determine resolve a case, not simply go where people might want to go based on their prejudices. And actually, I would argue that this may well be the case in this, that the media has an important role to play, but so does the special counsel, and so do actual judges presiding over cases in LA and in New York. And so we shouldn't, and incidentally, Congress also played a very important role with Nixon, and one of the big problems for me as a critic of Trump is the Republican Congress hasn't so far stepped up to play that role in this case. So we probably exaggerate our hopes in the media. The media by itself is unfortunately maybe, and I think this is true abroad too, the media can tell the truth about Orban in Hungary or about Duterte, but if there aren't institutions in the legal system, in the judicial system, other parts of government, parts of civil society that have independent standing that can also bring their weight to bear, one shouldn't count on the media being able to do everything.
Yeah, I think that's true, and not only Watergate, but you can look at the McCarthy years in the 1950s. There's public opinion changes slowly, but a lot of the change takes place beneath the surface, and gradually the pressures build up, and so the more fact-based reporting there is, the more the courts get involved, the Congress gets involved. It does eventually lead to change, and events can also dictate things. If the United States gets into a war or the stock market crashes, those external factors, I think, will also influence what people believe about politics and Trump and everything else.
Yeah, there's an interplay as well, right? I mean, it's not what the courts do, what the Congress does, what the media reports, what people believe, what the traffic will bear, what the poll numbers say, all that intertwines. So I want to open it up to the audience. If there are questions, you can go to these mics, or they're also come up. He's saying, please come up. So don't be shy, and we hope to answer some of your questions, if there are any questions. I think there must be some, and I see at least one. Thank you. Go ahead.
Go back to something you said earlier. Closer. Okay.
Just one reminder as we go into the question period, please keep your question relatively short and make sure there is a question. Please go ahead.
I'm a baby boomer. I grew up when I was watching TV, which I wasn't allowed to watch. There were a couple of things. One was Bonanza at 9 o'clock on Sunday, and then the parents would allow a news show. What I feel like now is fake news is kind of decided by certain channels. And a lot of those news shows we used to watch for getting the news is now entertainment. It's what you were saying, there's a false equivalency. You have someone who may know what they're talking about, representing one position, and then you have a talking head who's in opposition. It doesn't have to be correct, it doesn't have to be factual. They're just going to argue the opposite point, so people will roll their eyes and people will yell at the TV set and say, no, the one on the left is the one that's right. And I'm wondering how hard it is for many people to recognize the difference between actual news and annoying opinions.
Yeah, I mean, you think of CNN, cable news network, MSNBC. There's purportedly news channels, yet they've got 24 hours to fill. And let's face it, there's not that much news even in this crazy news cycle. And so there's an enormous amount of, I think of it as talk television. It's like talk radio. There's a lot of kibitzing on a range of topics, and it's very hard to discern, where new facts are coming in and where opinions are simply being shared. Is that you see that as a problem or solvable problem?
I mean, I don't know if it's really solvable. I personally prefer to think in late, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, I was on Fox News Sunday for almost a decade. I was editor of the Weekly Standard. I'd been in government, but I was now an editor. And the people who were on the panel originally were all editors or reporters. Now, or TV reporters as well. Some of them were editors of opinion journals, but there was no actual congressman or people working for a political party. And at some point, the powers that be at Fox decided, well, we'll mix it all up. It's more interesting for the viewers. We'll have a congressman. You see this all the time now, right? You're a congressman. You have someone who actually works for the administration or works for the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee or for a super PAC that's intervened and so forth. And I remember one of my colleagues who was conservative and, liked Fox at the time and so forth, saying, that's really going to change things. That's not right. I mean, whatever you think, Bill Kristol could be totally wrong, but he's not, working for the Republican Party, and occasionally he criticizes them, even if that's where his views are generally closer to than the Democrats, and the same with Juan Williams or something on the left. So, I mean, it really did change things. And I personally don't like the mixing, but it's very far along. And CNN did well by having all these Trump supporters who were not just Trump supporters, but were actually working for Trump, basically. And they still mix that up in that way. Having said all that, 2 million people watch CNN, 1 million people watch CNN at night, 2 million MSNBC, 2.5 million Fox News or something. We had 3 debates which were watched by 40, 50, 60 million people. So it's a little hard for me to I think maybe we sometimes overstate, since we're the type of people probably who do watch cable news, how important cable news is, and understate much deeper structural issues in the democracy that help drive people to the voting choices they make.
Please.
Hi. So I'm a millennial, so this talk of Facebook is obviously relevant to me, but there's also been this promulgation of other sources sort of muddying the waters of network and mainstream media. For instance, Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which is going in and buying all these local stations and then basically dictating to their own reporters what they can and cannot say. Also being encouraged by the deregulation with the FCC, and so all these sort of factors coming together to basically poison, if you will, discourse and spread propaganda in a much more easy way. So I'm curious sort of how one would combat that away from sort of just the internet-based news sources, but really even in you're coming into your homes every night.
So something closer to government-controlled news sources, I think, is what we're beginning to see at the edges.
I don't know. Sinclair is kind of interesting. There's a law that you can't own 2 different kinds of news sources in the same market, and there's some exceptions in certain markets. So in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is a classic small city, we own the newspaper. We actually also own a radio station, but that was grandfathered in before the law. But we don't have a television station in Reading. because frankly, that would be us. We have the newsroom that could do it, but we're not allowed by law. I mean, it's competition that'll solve that. If Sinclair, theoretically, if Sinclair is going to be right wing, I think that opens the door for someone on the left to start some alternative form, either something online, a radio station, something like that. That's the idea. Here's the overall problem, though, with the way Google and Facebook have taken all the advertising revenue to themselves. Now there really isn't money to set these up anymore.
Well, unless billionaires choose to look at people. I don't know. Liberals don't like concentrations of money and all this, and billionaires and so forth, and probably want more redistributed tax code. But actually, it's not such a bad thing that the Sulzberger family has been able to own the New York Times for a few generations and protect it from, so to speak, government force. And a private family owned the Washington Post for a long time, and Kay Graham famously defended the Post against government attempts to intimidate it. And Jeff Bezos owns the Post, and he's not very intimidated probably by Trump. So I do think it gets back to the question of you do want a lot of different sources of power in a society. I would say on the Sinclair, just on the local broadcasting thing for a second, though, I did a conversation recently with Jim Warren, who was editor of the Chicago Tribune, and he made a very good point, which I guess others have made, but really focused for me. I mean, if you're worried about Washington, whatever the merits of these panel discussions on CNN and whatever the merits of MSNBC and Fox, there are a lot of people following what's happening in the Trump administration. And there's, something comes out, there's a document that's released, a lot of people are analyzing it, you get different points of view. What is happening in Albany or in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? I mean, you used to have lots of people following state and local politics, and the economics have become very, very difficult now to maintain that. And those are not always the most ethical places in the world, and they always were challenging even in the old days. And I think Jim says that in Illinois there are now 3 reporters full-time covering in Springfield, covering the Illinois legislature, which has not been a model of probity and high ethics. And so as a governance matter, one worries, I think, about the local and state level, because there the economics have been so damaging to the kinds of papers that used to cover that, and those more than the national news.
I think that one trend that could be somewhat hopeful. I don't want to be the Pollyanna on this panel, but there are a lot of, in addition to billionaires, there are a lot of nonprofit local news organizations starting to spring up to fill the void in some of these places. But I think for the industry, it's the lack of local reporting and state level reporting, these news deserts, is one of the most critical issues, and something we need to address. And there's even this idea that there would be some kind of Peace Corps for reporters to go out.
Yeah, Reporters for America.
Yeah,
I think it's
right.
called.
Report
Yeah.
for America.
It's like Teach for America.
Right.
But, journalism for America.
Just to get journalists out there and cover the local town meetings and hold officials accountable.
I mean, Peter, this is part of your life in terms of the fate and the pressures on local news and what it means for a community when local news dries up.
Well, the community loses a sense of community if there's no news about itself. I mean, if all people are doing is listening to what's going on in Washington, D.C., or what major sports teams are doing and watching television, they start to get disconnected from their own community. It's hard to form a community. So, I mean, the news business evolved over time, and you go back to when my family started the newspaper in Pennsylvania back in 1796. It was like one sheet at a time, and there was like 8 of them, and frankly, they're all political.
8 newspapers.
Yeah.
In Reading.
Yeah. Eventually, and at first it was 2, 3, and you get about 8. And then, frankly, things evolved. The profession got better and better, and we started a daily paper in the late 1800s. And there's kind of a golden age, that we lived through here. And frankly, I think we became a more civil society because of that. And I think that, as cities grew, I think they grew as civil societies. I worry that, we're becoming so disconnected from each other that we're tribing up again. That seems to be happening again, even within our own communities. I worry that the lack of a central news source only makes that worse.
Question?
I think I know the answer to this, but Steve Burrell just talked about a new service that he's coming out with called NewsGuard that he's basically going to rate all of the news organizations based on their the fact finding or whatever, and then he's going to sell it to tech companies. So I'm wondering what you guys as newsmen and women think about that.
Actually, the guy I just mentioned, Jim Warren, I think is Brill's number 2 on this, so I know a little bit about it just from chatting with him. So this is good, because this is, I mean, unlike Facebook deciding how everyone should be rated, this is like Consumer Reports. They're going to rate people. Now, maybe they'll get some things wrong, and there should be 2 or 3 such groups doing the ratings, as there often are, like Yelp and other, people who rate restaurants or hotels. You don't depend on one. But I think that's a good sign, and I think we will have to be more, people will have to be more imaginative in the ways they think about doing this and not depend on it being top down. And I think a lot of these can be done by not-for-profit foundations, which then get grants from businesses and from wealthy individuals as well. And I think we will. So I think again, it's a good example of how you do want to have a society with lots of different sources of wealth and power and authority, and people feeling that they can step up and do this themselves, and not wait for some meeting at Facebook to decide to rank, to change the way they do the algorithms.
I think it could be interesting. The one thing that I guess makes me want to caution something like that is that there's a tendency to then rank maybe the biggest or most awarded newspapers the highest rank, but then that leaves out, not only does it leave out like papers that are owned by African Americans, which is the black press has really broken some really big stories. You think about Emmett Till, a lot of African American journalists get their start. Like I got my start at a weekly newspaper in South Florida called the West Side Gazette, that's still around. But then you also have papers. I used to work for Newsday, and I remember once writing about a city council that was trying to make permanent lifetime, give everybody who sat on the council permanent life insurance for life. And I wrote like one story, and like 300 people showed up, and it was like defeated. And I remember thinking then, like, wow, this journalism thing is real, because because you realize that like that they were going to do something that was completely objectively unethical, and they had to stop doing it. So you wonder, when you start ranking things, are you gonna leave out Ebony? Are you gonna leave out small papers that are doing stuff in small towns? And is that gonna then hurt them? Or if you're number 556 in the nation, but you actually are very ethical, what does that mean for you? Like I also think about, I'm not good at sports, so I'm gonna forget all this stuff, but UPenn, and the stories that local newspaper broke, they got a Pulitzer for writing about all the things that were going on at UPenn, and no one else was paying attention because it was essentially a local story that became national. It's really hard to figure out when you start making lists. It's one thing that almost like an accreditation system, where it's like, okay, we came in, we interviewed these people, we think that this is a great publication, or that they have the ethics to do the reporting. It's another thing to say you're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3. That's a different kind of ranking system that could easily become problematic.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, one thing we thought about when we did this fraudulent news report was should we advocate those kinds of standards. And we also thought about how that would play out around the world, where you have kind of intrepid journalists who can't get into the mainstream, who have been, all the Russian journalists we work with, for the most part, have been fired by the major outlets, and they've had to create their own sort of startups that don't have long track records. They don't have deep pockets, but they are really the only serious journalism in many cases that's going on. So I think,
Yeah, but I think you're onto
the
something.
value and the caution are both, merited.
And it is a matter of, accrediting news organizations that meet the sort of basic standards for what is journalism, but not choosing amongst them. So that, so that's, I think those are the kind of trust indicators that not only the platforms are hungry for, but ordinary people are hungry for, and to know who they can trust. So I think it's a positive initiative.
Another question?
Yeah, I just wonder if each of you could give us a couple of suggestions about how we and our kids and our students can support journalism, and how can we help shift this to really change things up, and what can we do to support all of you?
Subscribe.
I mean, it really is subscribing, and it's watching PBS NewsHour either live at 6 p.m. or online. But it really is coming down to dollars. Like, I subscribe and pay money for the New York Times and for the Washington Post. I want to make sure that that I'm spending my money on that. And I've argued with my friends who say, "Oh, well, why do I need to do this? Because I didn't like this one article." And it's like, okay, but like, what if the entire New York Times or Washington Post wasn't here? What less would we know? So a lot of it is really putting money behind where you're spending your money.
And encourage them to read the local paper or pay attention to the local news, because I think we're becoming so disconnected from that. All the sensational national stuff, all the entertainment news. I mean, we're becoming so disconnected, and read a lot of things too, right?
I mean, I got into this, sort of mid-career in the magazine, so didn't go to journalism school and all that. I would just say, though, having watched the it's hard if you haven't been in the business to appreciate the economic pressures and how difficult they are for mainstream journalism. Advertising supported newspapers and, of course, supported television. That's why when you watched CBS or ABC News or whatever the news show you were allowed to watch in addition to Bonanza, you didn't pay for it. It was on free, right? It was on a national network TV because the advertisers paid for the show and the advertisers paid for the newspapers, which is why they could charge 25 cents or 50 cents or even today $2 or $3, which is below the cost of actually the reporters, the editorial room, the printing, the distribution. It costs a lot to afford, a lot of trucks and a lot of people to get 400,000 newspapers delivered each morning in Manhattan, in New York City, not just Manhattan. The Times or whatever, or 600,000, whatever their local circulation is now. So, I mean, and there, the collapse, and it's just due to technology, really. The classified ads were an incredible source of revenue. The display ads, Macy's, the car ads, the Sunday ads. You couldn't get an apartment. I must remember, moving and you had to go buy the Sunday newspaper to see what possible houses or apartments you could rent. People do not do that anymore. So really, that's just a structural change. I like all structural changes. It'll sort of work itself out in a way, but it does mean that people are much more dependent on subscriptions. And I think ultimately people are going to have to go to a model a little bit like universities. Universities and colleges do get tuition, and that pays a chunk of their cost. They also get big grants from foundations and wealthy individuals to pay for particular things. And I suspect we'll end up 20, 30, 40 years from now with the symphony model or the university model as opposed to a purely advertiser and subscriber model. Because it's just, you cannot have, the Times and the Journal and the Post are unique, but it's very, very hard to maintain large newsrooms, foreign bureaus. It's a real crisis, not just in the States and the localities, but abroad, I think. That's expensive to do. And if you're not going to have real advertising revenues coming into your pages, or to some degree even to the networks, it's very hard to support that.
I think the other thing, aside from subscribing or supporting financially, I think everyone can speak up for the values of journalism and for the values of accuracy and balance, and sort of demand that of the publications you follow. And interact with your local editors and reporters too, and help. There is a big push now for citizen journalists who can tell, who can get the story out sometimes much faster than the professional journalists can. So that interaction, that speaking up for the values, being a concerned citizen, and supporting news publications, all those things can be done to help the institutions.
We have one more question, please. If you want, I'll take you too, and then we'll close, because I know we started a couple minutes late.
I know you've talked about the importance of the law and the court system in upholding just good journalism and protecting the voters, but I wonder what happens when the law is weaponized against publications, thinking specifically about BuzzFeed and them fighting to publish the Steele dossier, or in the opposite end, when up and coming publications don't have the funds to have a legal and standards team, and kind of are threatened with litigation for publishing stories or breaking stories about powerful people, or the fact that stories about like Harvey Weinstein have been buried for so long because he had such a strong law team behind him. What does that mean for these small local papers or these online publications that don't necessarily have the masthead of the Times or the Washington Post, and how can they protect themselves while also
Right.
doing important work?
Gawker would be another example of that. A publication shut down, because of a lawsuit that ultimately they couldn't appeal, because the bond that they had to post in Florida was so large that it essentially forced them into bankruptcy and to be sold and closed.
Of course, these are laws that also keep people from publishing fake news. I mean, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. You don't want to have the bad guys weaponizing it to shut people down. That's wrong. But you hope that public opinion sees that, and other journals write about that and call them to task. But honestly, those laws are there to protect society from what we're now experiencing from the republishing segment, the Google segment, the Facebook segment that has no responsibility. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword, I guess.
Anyone else?
But I would
Well-
the Gawker thing I think is a very different, I'm not that sympathetic to Gawker. They went to a court case and they lost, and maybe they didn't have the money to appeal, but of course someone could have put up the money for them to appeal. I think we're going to have to think in a different model. How do we think about lawyers protecting other vulnerable groups or underfunded groups in society? We think of public interest law. We think of all kinds of civil society organizations that are set up to provide legal help, legal aid for various groups, minorities who are discriminated against, professions that are endangered, individuals that are endangered, causes that need to have representation in court and so forth. And maybe we need to think about that in terms of publications too. They're for-profit. They're mostly owned by for-profit entities, so one thinks of them not as the civil rights cause exactly, but as some business. And some of them are businesses, and some of them have some money, but a lot of them don't have that much money. And it wouldn't be crazy. I come back to the previous answer. I mean, it's funny that we have no one thinks anything of some wealthy guy or woman giving $3 or $4 million to university to have a chair in Russian history. That's great. I'm for that kind of thing, and even in fact, a lot of that keeps parts of classics and things I care about alive in the academy that otherwise don't meet the market test, and universities will close it down, right? But someone gives a chair, and then you can have someone who is supported and does a good new translation of the Odyssey or whatever. But you could have the same in journalism. There's no reason you couldn't have the XYZ chair at the Washington Post or the New York Times or at a magazine in covering Eastern Europe, to take a place that's obviously having challenges in democracy. And as long as there was the usual barriers to make sure it wasn't just reflecting his views, which they do that in the universities too, and there was an endowment and you could pay for more. So I kind of think in general we're going to have to think more creatively about how to, as a country, not for the government, but how to support news gathering and news promulgation and news fact checking. And that's why I'm sort of like the Steve Brill thing. It's an attempt from the bottom up to say, well, let's form an organization. Now, he has a view that he can monetize it, which I'm dubious about, by selling it to the big tech companies. In a way, why doesn't he just set up a 501c3, a charitable organization, and say, I'm doing this for the public good, and let me go raise money from a whole bunch of do-good foundations and wealthy individuals to do this. But I think we may have to think more in that way. We had a model for a golden age, maybe, where newspapers could both do good and make money, and TV news could as well, and I'm just not sure that's going to be possible in the future.
Okay. Okay, our last question, please.
What hope can I have for that significant percentage of the population here in the country that seems to be more susceptible to fake news, whether it's because of their confirmation bias or their inability to discern between opinion and fact?
What hope can you have for them?
Yes.
Well, I
Those
just think
forlorn souls?
people, people, one shouldn't overreact to one election, which is really what we're talking about here. I mean, this same country elected Barack Obama twice and is going to elect a Democratic House in 2018. So people are not sheep. People have their views. There's always some people have bigoted views, and some people are very susceptible to fake news and propaganda. Others are just mistaken. Others just have views that people differ with, and on both sides, and they have different life experiences and have drawn different conclusions from their own lives and their own communities and their own reading of history. But I'm not that pessimistic that the whole country has suddenly, veered off into a no world, into a huge swamp of know-nothingism. I think there's a particular There are some particular things that happened in the last 2, 3, 4 years, and some technological changes, both broadly for the society as a whole, and then that affected news media and information distribution particularly, and that is the internet and Facebook and social media and so forth. A lot of things came together, you know, and in an unfortunate way, I would be the first to say, in November 2016. But I don't know that that will necessarily continue to be the case forever, or even for that much longer.
I was going to
Peter,
add maybe a solution though. You know, with the privacy laws the way they are, the problem is that, you know, the bad guys, the fake news guys, can know the confirmation bias that these people have, and then feed them something that triggers that to get a result. I think that the answer to that, I think, is in privacy laws. I'm not sure you should be able to buy that detailed information that you can psychologically profile someone, feed them something fake, and then get a result. And that's the Cambridge Analytica model, and I think that's clearly dangerous.
Anything else? Okay. Well, this panel was not fake news. So I want to thank all four of you and our audience. Thank you.